The radio crackled with static death. Major Kellerman pressed his back against the concrete barrier, feeling the percussion of mortars shake his teeth loose. 3 clicks northeast of Kandahar, his unit was hemorrhaging men into the dust while Taliban fighters closed the noose from elevated positions. The air support he'd been promised was 40 minutes out, 40 minutes his Marines didn't have. Actual, this is Bravo 6, his voice cut through the chaos. We are combat ineffective. Repeat, combat ineffective. Where's my goddamn air cover? The response came wrapped in bureaucratic calm that made his blood boil. Bravo 6, be advised your CAS package is delayed due to weather conditions over Bagram. Estimate 30 mics. Kellerman watched Corporal Martinez drag Sergeant Rivers behind cover, leaving a crimson trail in the sand. Rivers wasn't getting up. None of them were going to get up if something didn't change in the next 10 minutes. The enemy fire was methodical now, patient. They knew they had him. That's when the sound came, low, guttural, like a chainsaw made of thunder. Every Marine in that compound knew that sound. The GAU-8 Avenger, 30 millimeter of pure hate delivered at 3,900 rounds per minute, but the weather was socked in. No aircraft should be flying. The A-10 Thunderbolt II materialized from the gray soup like a ghost made of titanium and fury. It came in so low that Kellerman could see the pilot's helmet, so close that the exhaust wash kicked sand into his face. The aircraft's distinctive twin engines and straight wings cut through the overcast with impossible precision. Unknown aircraft, the radio barked. You are not cleared for this airspace. Identify yourself immediately. The response came in a voice that was steady as bedrock, touched with just the faintest drawl. Tower, this is Reaper 77. I've got Marines in trouble down there. Consider me cleared hot. Kellerman had never heard that call sign before. Reaper 77 wasn't on any flight manifest he'd seen. But as the A-10 banked hard left and aligned for its gun run, he didn't care if it was flown by the Angel of Death himself. The first pass was surgical, a 2-second burst that turned the enemy's primary fighting position into smoking crater. The second pass was artistic, cluster munitions that cleared the ridgeline like an eraser across a chalkboard. By the third pass, the Taliban were in full retreat, leaving their weapons scattered across the rocks like broken toys. As quickly as it had appeared, the gray aircraft vanished back into the clouds, leaving only the echo of its engines and the blessed silence of a battlefield won. Reaper 77, Kellerman called into his radio. You just saved 32 Marines. Who the hell are you? The answer would haunt him for years. Just passing through, Major. Glad I could help. The radio crackled once more, then went silent. In the operations center at Bagram, a young lieutenant stared at his radar screen in confusion. According to his instruments, no aircraft had been airborne in that sector for the past 6 hours. The storm had grounded everything with wings. But Major Kellerman's after-action report would tell a different story, one that would ripple through the corridors of the Pentagon and eventually reach a small office in Virginia, where a woman with silver-streaked hair would set down her coffee cup and smile for the first time in months. The mystery of Reaper 77 had begun. In the weeks that followed, reports trickled in from across the Afghan theater. A convoy pinned down in Helmand province rescued by an A-10 that appeared from nowhere. Special Forces operators in Kunar pulling back from a compromised position when familiar twin engines announced salvation from above. Each time, the same call sign. Each time, the same impossible circumstances. Aircraft flying when nothing should be airborne, appearing in places where no friendly assets were supposed to be. The Pentagon's response was predictable. Classified memos, closed-door briefings, and official denials. But the word spread among the troops like wildfire. Reaper 77 was out there, watching over them, ready to appear when all hope seemed lost. Colonel Patricia Vance, Deputy Director of Air Combat Operations, found herself fielding increasingly frantic calls from field commanders demanding answers she didn't have. The call sign wasn't in any database. No A-10 squadron reported missing aircraft. Flight logs showed perfect accountability for every Thunderbolt II in the inventory. "It's impossible," she told her staff during one particularly heated briefing. "Ghosts don't fly combat missions." But Captain Mitchell Chen, her intelligence officer, had been compiling data that suggested otherwise. Maintenance records from 3 different bases showed missing ordnance that couldn't be accounted for. Fuel consumption reports had unexplained discrepancies. Most troubling of all, several ground crews reported seeing an A-10 landing at remote airstrips in the dead of night, only to find empty tarmac when they investigated. The pattern was too precise to be coincidence, too widespread to be deception. Someone was flying combat missions without authorization, using resources that didn't officially exist, and saving American lives with a skill level that bordered on supernatural. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, a crew chief with 22 years of service, approached Chen after a briefing with information that made his blood run cold. "Sir," she said quietly, "I think I know who your ghost pilot is, but you're not going to like what I have to tell you." Rodriguez had been reviewing maintenance logs from 18 months prior. The night before Captain Isabella Reaper Vasquez had been shot down over Wardeck Province. Her A-10, tail number 790177, had been reported destroyed after a surface-to-air missile strike. The wreckage had never been recovered, officially listed as lost in hostile territory. But Rodriguez remembered something the official reports had overlooked. The aircraft's emergency transponder had continued broadcasting for 6 hours after the reported shootdown, transmitting from a location 40 kilometers from the crash site. The signal had been dismissed as equipment malfunction. "Captain Vasquez was the best pilot I ever worked with," Rodriguez said. "If anyone could have walked away from that crash, it would have been her." Chen felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with terrifying clarity. Isabella Vasquez, call sign Reaper, had been presumed killed in action, her body never recovered. Her memorial service had been attended by 300 people, including her younger sister who served as an Air Force mechanic. The official investigation had concluded that her remains were likely destroyed in the post-crash explosion. But what if Captain Vasquez had survived? What if she'd been flying unauthorized missions for the past 18 months, using her presumed death as cover to wage her own private war against the enemy that had tried to kill her? The implications were staggering. If Chen was right, they weren't dealing with a rogue pilot. They were dealing with a dead woman who had refused to stay buried. Colonel Vance listened to Chen's briefing with growing unease. Every instinct told her to bury this information, to classify it beyond the reach of curious journalists and congressional inquiries. But the reports kept coming in, and with each rescue attributed to Reaper 77, the legend grew stronger. The truth about Isabella Vasquez demanded to be told, even if it shattered everything they thought they knew about war, death, and the bonds that tie soldiers to their mission. The hunt for the ghost pilot was about to begin in earnest, and Colonel Vance suspected that finding her would be easier than deciding what to do with her once they did. The Afghan mountains held their secrets close, but some ghosts refused to rest until their work was finished. At Forward Operating Base Shank, Lieutenant Torres was having the worst day of his deployment. His convoy had been ambushed 20 clicks south of the base, and half his vehicles were disabled. The Taliban had them pinned in a dried riverbed with no cover and nowhere to run. His radio operator was unconscious. His medic was trying to stop 3 different soldiers from bleeding out, and the enemy was closing in from 2 directions. Torres had been in country for 4 months, long enough to know when a situation was hopeless. This was one of those times. He was reaching for his sidearm, preparing to make his last stand, when the distinctive whine of turboprops cut through the gunfire. The A-10 came in from the south, following the riverbed at an altitude that seemed impossible. Torres could see the pilot's helmet, could almost count the rivets on the aircraft's belly. The GAU-8 spoke with its familiar voice of thunder, and suddenly the Taliban position on the eastern ridge simply ceased to exist. "Friendlies in the riverbed, this is Reaper 77, the voice said over his radio. The tone was calm, professional, with just a hint of accent that Torres couldn't quite place. "I count 6 disabled vehicles and multiple casualties. Medical evac is inbound, ETA 12 minutes. Stay low and keep your heads down." The second gun run took out the western position. The third scattered the remaining enemy fighters like leaves in a hurricane. By the time the rescue helicopters arrived, the battlefield was silent except for the moans of wounded Marines. Torres never got a chance to thank the pilot. By the time he looked up, the gray aircraft was already disappearing into the haze, leaving only contrails and the sweet smell of burnt cordite. That night back at Shank, Torres found himself in the TOC, staring at the operations board. According to the flight schedule, no A-10s had been airborne during the time of his rescue. The duty officer, a major with tired eyes, just shrugged when Torres asked about it. "Kid," the major said, "there's a lot of things in this war that don't make it into the official reports. Sometimes it's better that way." But Torres couldn't let it go. He'd seen the aircraft, heard the pilot's voice, felt the ground shake as 30mm rounds tore his enemies apart. That wasn't imagination or combat stress. That was real as the scar on his forehead where shrapnel had kissed him. He started asking questions, quietly at first, then with growing persistence. The answers he got were always the same: polite deflection, knowing smiles, and the kind of silence that suggested he was asking about things above his pay grade. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Corporal Diana Reeves, a mechanic with the maintenance squadron, approached him after chow one evening with a story that made his blood run cold. "LT," she said quietly, "you've been asking about that saved your ass last week. I might know something about that." Reeves had been on duty the night before, working late in the hangar when she heard aircraft engines. Nothing unusual about that. Birds came and went at all hours. But when she stepped outside for a smoke, she saw something that shouldn't have been there. An A-10 was taxiing toward the fuel pits, its position lights dark, moving like a ghost in the desert night. She watched it refuel and rearm with the efficiency of a pit crew that had done this dance 1,000 times before. The ground crew worked in silence, no radio chatter, no casual conversation. Professional and precise. "The weird thing," Reeves continued, "was that I knew that aircraft. Tail number 790177. I worked on that bird for 6 months before it got shot down last year. Captain Vasquez's ride." Torres felt his world tilt sideways. Captain Vasquez was dead, killed in action 18 months ago. Her name was on the memorial wall in the base chapel. He'd walked past it 100 times. "You sure about the tail number?" he asked. "Dead sure. I painted those numbers myself. Besides," Reeves paused, taking a long drag from her cigarette, "I recognized the pilot too. Same way she always walked, same way she moved around the aircraft, like she was dancing with it." "That's impossible." "Yeah," Reeves said with a sad smile. "That's what I keep telling myself too." The conversation haunted Torres for days. He found himself studying the memorial wall, reading Captain Vasquez's citation over and over. Distinguished Flying Cross, Purple Heart, Air Medal with 4 oak leaf clusters. The kind of record that belonged to legends, not ghosts. But legends, Torres was beginning to understand, sometimes refused to stay buried. In her small apartment in Arlington, Virginia, Maria Vasquez set down her morning coffee and stared at the photograph on her kitchen table. Her sister Isabella smiled back at her from behind the cockpit of an A-10, flight suit unzipped, helmet tucked under her arm. The picture had been taken 3 days before the mission that killed her. Maria had been grieving for 18 months, but lately, the grief had been mixed with something else. Hope, maybe, or just desperate wishful thinking. The reports were getting harder to ignore. Soldiers posting on social media about a mysterious A-10 pilot who appeared when all hope seemed lost. Videos taken on cell phones showing an aircraft that looked exactly like her sister's, down to the distinctive nose art that Maria had helped design. The nose art was the detail that made Maria's heart stop. A stylized reaper holding a rose instead of a scythe, painted just below the cockpit rail. Isabella had added it after their mother's death, a way to carry family love into battle. No other A-10 in the Air Force had that exact design. Maria was a helicopter mechanic herself, stationed at Andrews Air Force Base. She understood aircraft, understood what was possible and what wasn't. Dead pilots didn't fly rescue missions. Shot-down aircraft didn't refuel at midnight. But the evidence was piling up like snowdrift, and Maria was running out of rational explanations. She'd made inquiries through official channels, careful not to sound like a crazy person. The responses were always the same: polite sympathy for her loss and gentle suggestions that grief could manifest in unexpected ways. But Maria had seen the videos, read the reports, heard the stories filtering back from Afghanistan. Her sister was alive. Somehow, impossibly, Isabella was still fighting her war from beyond the grave. The phone rang, startling Maria from her thoughts. The caller ID showed a Virginia area code she didn't recognize. "Ms. Vasquez, this is Colonel Patricia Vance, Air Force Operations. I wonder if we could talk." Maria's heart hammered against her ribs. "About what, ma'am?" "About your sister, Ms. Vasquez. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about Captain Isabella Vasquez and what really happened over Wardeck Province 18 months ago." The meeting was arranged for the following day, in a nondescript office building in Crystal City. Colonel Vance was younger than Maria had expected, with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen too much and forgotten too little. "What I'm about to tell you is classified," Vance began without preamble. "But recent events have made it clear that the official story needs revision." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, transcripts, and intelligence reports that Maria's untrained eye couldn't fully decode. But the gist was clear enough. Her sister's aircraft had been damaged, not destroyed. The pilot had managed a controlled crash landing in a remote valley. The emergency beacon had transmitted for 6 hours before going silent. "We mounted a search and rescue operation," Vance continued, "but the area was too hot. Heavy Taliban presence, surface-to-air missiles, the works. After 48 hours with no additional signals, we had to call it off." "So she was alive?" "We think so, yes. But Ms. Vasquez, what I'm about to tell you next is going to be hard to accept. We believe your sister has been conducting unauthorized combat operations for the past 18 months, flying missions without orders, using resources that officially don't exist." Maria stared at the photographs of her sister's crashed aircraft. The fuselage was intact, the cockpit empty. "How is that possible?" Colonel Vance leaned back in her chair, choosing her words carefully. "Your sister was resourceful. Before the crash, she'd been investigating reports of missing equipment, unexplained fuel consumption, maintenance discrepancies. We think she'd been preparing for something like this." The picture that emerged was of a pilot who'd used her presumed death as the ultimate cover story. Isabella had somehow salvaged her aircraft, established a network of sympathetic ground crews, and created her own private war against the Taliban. She was a ghost in the machine, invisible to official oversight but all too real to the enemies who faced her guns. "Why are you telling me this now?" Maria asked. "Because," Vance said quietly, "we need to bring her home. What she's doing, it can't continue. She's operating without support, without backup, without any of the safety nets that keep pilots alive. Sooner or later, her luck is going to run out. Maria understood the subtext. Her sister was living on borrowed time, flying missions that should have killed her months ago. The only question was whether they could find her before she finally pushed her luck too far. The search for Reaper 77 was about to become official, and Maria Vasquez was going to help them find the ghost who wore her sister's face. The valley where Captain Isabella Vasquez had died was a scar in the earth, carved by ancient rivers and modern war. Sergeant First Class Jimmy Kowalski had been part of the original search team, one of the few soldiers who'd actually seen the crash site before it was declared too dangerous to revisit. Now, 18 months later, he found himself leading a second expedition into the same hostile territory. This time, they weren't looking for a body, they were hunting a ghost. "Remember," Colonel Vance had told him during the briefing, "we're dealing with someone who's been surviving in enemy territory for over a year. She's not going to trust easily, and she's got every reason to think we're here to stop her rather than help her." Kowalski understood. If he'd been shot down and left for dead, he might not be thrilled to see his own people coming for him either, especially if those people represented the bureaucracy that had abandoned him in the first place. The team moved through the mountains with practiced stealth, 12 rangers, 2 intelligence officers, and a medical team prepared for any contingency. They knew Vasquez was out there somewhere, but the valley held 1,000 hiding places, and she'd had 18 months to learn every shadow. The first sign came on their second day. Fresh tire tracks leading away from what looked like a natural cave entrance. The tracks were wide, deep, consistent with an aircraft that had been repeatedly moved in and out of concealment. Inside the cave, they found confirmation. Tie-down points drilled into the rock floor, fuel stains, and the distinctive smell of jet exhaust. "She's been here," Captain Chen reported over encrypted radio. "But this site's cold, hasn't been used in weeks." The search expanded. Kowalski's team found 3 more caves, each showing signs of recent aircraft activity. It was like following breadcrumbs left by someone who wanted to be found but wasn't quite ready to surrender. The pattern suggested movement, evolution, a pilot adapting to changing circumstances, staying one step ahead of both enemy and ally. On the 4th day, they found her. The A-10 was hidden in a canyon so narrow that Kowalski almost missed it entirely. The aircraft had been positioned with mathematical precision, angled to catch morning sun on its solar panels while remaining invisible from aerial reconnaissance. Camouflage netting covered the wings, and the engines were warm. She'd been flying recently. But the pilot was nowhere to be found. "Captain Vasquez," Kowalski called into the canyon's echoing silence. "I'm Sergeant First Class Kowalski, U.S. Army. I was part of the team that searched for you 18 months ago. We're here to bring you home." The answer came from above, from a ledge Kowalski hadn't even noticed. The voice was exactly as he remembered from the radio intercepts, calm, professional, tinged with an accent that spoke of Texas heat and family dinners. "Hello, Sergeant. Took you long enough to find me." Captain Isabella Vasquez rappelled down from her perch with fluid grace, landing 20 feet from Kowalski's position. She looked exactly as he remembered from her service photos, with one crucial difference. Her eyes held the weight of 18 months spent in hell, fighting a war that the world thought she'd already died in. "Ma'am," Kowalski said carefully, "Colonel Vance sends her compliments. She'd very much like to speak with you." Vasquez studied the Rangers with the calculating gaze of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "And what does the good colonel want to discuss?" "Your future, ma'am, and your past. Turns out there are a lot of Marines who owe you their lives. That counts for something in Washington these days." For the first time since they'd found her, Vasquez smiled. It was a tired expression, touched with sadness but also with something that might have been relief. "I suppose," she said quietly, "it's time to stop being a ghost." The flight back to Bagram was surreal. Vasquez flew her own aircraft, flanked by two F-16s that served as both escort and guard. Kowalski rode in the backseat of one of the fighters, watching the A-10 through his side window and trying to process what they'd accomplished. They'd found their ghost. Now came the harder part, deciding what to do with her. The landing at Bagram drew a crowd that Vasquez clearly wasn't prepared for. Word had leaked despite security protocols, and half the base seemed to be lined up along the flight line. As she climbed down from her cockpit, the silence was deafening. Hundreds of soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen watching a dead woman walk among them. Then someone started clapping. Kowalski couldn't see who, but the sound spread like wildfire until the entire crowd was applauding. Not the polite recognition of a returning hero, but the fierce appreciation of warriors acknowledging one of their own. Vasquez stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the reception. 18 months of solitary war had ill-prepared her for human contact, much less adoration. But as the applause continued, her military bearing reasserted itself. She straightened her shoulders, raised her chin, and walked toward the waiting vehicles with the dignity of a pilot who'd never learned how to surrender. Colonel Vance was waiting in the debriefing room, along with a handful of officers whose rank insignia suggested that Washington was taking this situation very seriously indeed. But before the formal proceedings could begin, Vance did something unexpected. She stood and saluted. "Captain Vasquez," she said formally, "welcome back from the dead." The debriefing lasted 14 hours. Vasquez spoke with mechanical precision about her survival, her salvage of the aircraft, her establishment of hidden bases throughout the Afghan mountains. She described 18 months of solitary combat operations, over 200 missions flown without orders, authorization, or official support. The statistics were staggering: 37 convoy rescues, 41 close air support missions for troops in contact, 16 medical evacuations conducted under impossible conditions, an estimated 800 American lives saved by a pilot who, according to all official records, had been dead for over a year. "The question now," General Morrison said during a brief recess, "is what we do with her. Technically, she's been AWOL for 18 months. Technically, she's stolen government property and conducted unauthorized military operations. Technically, she should face court-martial." "And practically?" Vance asked. Morrison gestured toward the window, where soldiers were still gathering to catch a glimpse of the legendary Reaper 77. "Practically, she's a national hero. Courts-martial don't work well when the defendant saved more American lives than most entire squadrons." The bureaucratic machinery ground slowly, but it ground. Lawyers consulted precedents that didn't exist. Psychiatrists evaluated a patient who defied every textbook. Intelligence officers tried to assess the security implications of a pilot who'd been operating in the shadows for longer than most deployments lasted. In the end, the decision came from the highest levels of the Pentagon. Captain Isabella Vasquez would be quietly reinstated to active duty, with full back pay and benefits. Her unauthorized operations would be retroactively classified as a special access program. The official record would show an 18-month deep cover mission that had never actually been authorized, but had achieved results that couldn't be ignored. It was the kind of bureaucratic fiction that the military occasionally used to paper over inconvenient truths. But it worked, and that was what mattered. The ceremony was small and private, held in a secure conference room at the Pentagon. Maria Vasquez flew in from Virginia to watch her sister receive the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second-highest decoration for valor, awarded for her 18 months of unauthorized heroism. As the ribbon was pinned to her dress uniform, Isabella's eyes found her sister in the small crowd. For the first time since her presumed death, she smiled with genuine warmth. "Ma'am," the presenting officer said quietly, "you've served with distinction under circumstances that no training could have prepared you for. The United States owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. Vasquez accepted the decoration with the same calm professionalism she'd shown throughout her ordeal. But when the ceremony ended and the officials filed out, she finally allowed herself to be human again. The reunion with Maria was everything that 18 months of separation had built up to be: tears, laughter, and the fierce embrace of sisters who'd thought they'd lost each other forever. "I knew you were alive," Maria whispered. "I don't know how, but I knew. I'm sorry I couldn't contact you. I couldn't risk." "Don't," Maria pulled back, studying her sister's face. "Don't apologize for surviving. Don't apologize for being the most stubborn, resourceful, magnificent pain in the ass the Air Force has ever produced." They talked through the night, filling in gaps that official debriefs couldn't capture. Isabella spoke about the loneliness, the constant fear, the weight of carrying on a war that she couldn't acknowledge and couldn't abandon. Maria talked about the grief, the hope, the growing certainty that her sister was somehow still fighting battles that the world had forgotten. As dawn broke over Washington, both sisters understood that the hardest part wasn't over, it was just beginning. Isabella would have to learn how to be alive again, how to function in a world that had moved on without her. Maria would have to help her sister navigate a transition that no manual had ever covered. But they'd face it together, the way the Vasquez sisters had always faced impossible odds. With stubborn determination, mutual support, and the absolute certainty that family bonds were stronger than death, bureaucracy, or the collected weight of 18 months in hell. Outside their hotel window, the sun rose over a capital city where politicians would spend the day debating the finer points of military policy. But in a small room filled with the quiet conversation of sisters, the real work of healing was already underway. The return to active duty was supposed to be routine: medical evaluations, psychological assessments, and gradual reintegration into normal squadron operations. But nothing about Captain Isabella Vasquez would ever be routine again. Her first assignment was as an instructor pilot at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, home of the A-10 community. The posting made sense on paper: take an experienced pilot with exceptional combat credentials and let her pass that knowledge to the next generation. In reality, it was the Air Force's way of keeping their ghost pilot where they could see her, while figuring out what to do with a legend who refused to act legendary. The student pilots knew who she was, of course. In an age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, it was impossible to keep the story of Reaper 77 completely secret. But Vasquez deflected attention with practiced ease, focusing on the technical aspects of flight instruction while avoiding the dramatic elements that made journalists salivate. "The A-10 is not a glamorous aircraft," she told her first class of student pilots. "It's not fast, it's not pretty, and it will never win any beauty contests. But it will bring you home when everything else fails, and it will put ordnance exactly where you need it when Marines are depending on you to save their lives." Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Barnes, the squadron commander, watched Vasquez work with growing admiration. The woman who'd spent 18 months in isolation adapted to instruction duties with seamless professionalism, sharing hard-won expertise without dwelling on the circumstances that had earned it. "She's good," Barnes told Colonel Vance during one of their weekly check-in calls. "Better than good. She's exactly what these kids need. Someone who's been there and done that and lived to tell about it." "Any problems?" "Nothing major. She doesn't socialize much, keeps to herself outside of duty hours. But that's understandable given what she's been through. The nightmares are getting better, according to the flight surgeon." Vance made notes in the file that had grown surprisingly thick over the past 6 months. Vasquez was adapting better than anyone had dared hope, but the process wasn't without complications. She struggled with authority structures that she'd learned to ignore, chafed at regulations that seemed pointless after 18 months of improvised survival, and occasionally displayed the kind of tactical thinking that made sense in combat but worried peacetime administrators. The breakthrough came during a training exercise that went sideways. Second Lieutenant Marcus Webb was flying his first solo mission in the training area when his aircraft developed hydraulic problems. Not immediately life-threatening, but serious enough to require an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airfield. The problem was that the nearest airfield was 50 miles away, and Webb was losing hydraulic pressure faster than his emergency procedures could compensate for. He had maybe 10 minutes before his aircraft became uncontrollable, and 8 minutes of that would be spent flying over mountainous terrain with no suitable landing sites. Gila 7, this is Tower, the controller called. Recommend immediate divert to Phoenix Mesa. Vector 180, distance 47 miles. Tower, Gila 7. Webb's voice was tight with controlled panic. I don't think I can make Phoenix Mesa. Hydraulics are failing faster than checklist procedures. Vasquez was monitoring the frequency from her instructor station. She listened to Webb's situation report with growing concern, calculating flight times and failure rates with the cold precision of someone who'd faced similar emergencies alone in hostile territory. Tower, this is Reaper 77, she transmitted without authorization. Request permission to join up with Gila 7 and assist with emergency procedures. The tower controller hesitated. Vasquez wasn't supposed to be airborne. She was scheduled for ground duties that afternoon. But the urgency in Webb's transmissions was escalating, and they needed every available asset. Reaper 77, Tower. You are cleared for emergency launch, runway 27. Vasquez was airborne in 4 minutes, vectoring toward Webb's position with the kind of precision that comes from years of flying into impossible situations. She found him at 12,000 feet, struggling to maintain control as his aircraft systems failed one by one. Gila 7, Reaper 77, she called. I'm on your left wing. Let's talk through this together. What followed was a master class in crisis management. Vasquez guided Webb through emergency procedures that weren't in any manual, techniques she'd learned during 18 months of keeping damaged aircraft flying over hostile territory. She talked him through partial system failures, helped him redistribute hydraulic fluid, and coached him through a landing approach that required skills no second lieutenant should have possessed. You're doing great, Gila 7, just like we practiced, except this time it matters. Bring her down easy, trust your training, and remember, the A-10 wants to fly. Let her help you. Webb's landing was textbook perfect, considering the circumstances. His aircraft rolled to a stop on the runway with both pilots and machine intact, and the emergency vehicles that had been standing by returned to quarters with nothing to do but congratulate the young pilot on his successful emergency procedures. The debrief was illuminating. Webb credited Vasquez with saving his life, but she deflected the praise with characteristic modesty. You saved yourself, she told him. I just reminded you of things you already knew. The training worked exactly like it was supposed to. Colonel Barnes watched the interaction with growing understanding. Vasquez wasn't just an instructor pilot. She was exactly what the Air Force needed her to be. A teacher who could pass along not just technical knowledge, but the kind of confidence that comes from surviving impossible circumstances. How do you know all that stuff about emergency procedures? Webb asked after the formal debrief ended. Vasquez smiled with the tired warmth of someone who'd earned the right to share hard truths with the next generation. Kid, she said quietly, when you spend 18 months keeping a shot-up airplane flying over Afghanistan, you learn things that aren't in any textbook. The A-10 is a tough old bird, but she'll teach you everything you need to know if you're willing to listen. The story spread through the A-10 community with viral intensity. Not the dramatic elements that journalists loved, but the practical recognition that Reaper 77 was exactly what every student pilot hoped to become, someone who could bring them home when everything else failed. Colonel Vance smiled when she read Barnes' report. The Air Force's gamble was paying off. They'd brought their ghost pilot home, and she was becoming something even more valuable than a legend. She was becoming the teacher who would pass her hard-won knowledge to the next generation of pilots who might someday need those lessons to survive their own impossible circumstances. The integration was complete. Captain Isabella Vasquez was no longer a ghost. She was exactly what she'd always been. A pilot who refused to let her people down, whether those people were Marines under fire in Afghanistan or student pilots learning to master an aircraft that would someday be their salvation. The air show circuit was Colonel Barnes' idea. "We need to show off what the A-10 can do," she explained to Vasquez during one of their monthly evaluation meetings. "Congress is talking about retirement again, budget cuts, next-generation replacements. Sometimes the best argument for keeping something is showing people why it matters." Vasquez listened with the polite attention of someone who'd learned that military politics rarely aligned with military reality. She understood the game. Put the legendary pilot in front of cameras and crowds. Let her demonstrate the capabilities that kept Marines alive, and hope that public relations could accomplish what tactical excellence couldn't. "I'm not really the public speaking type, ma'am," she said diplomatically. "You don't have to speak, Barnes,"